Hey, folks, welcome to our Wednesday night study. I'm calling this Connecting the Dots, and this is our replacement study. We were studying the Bible from 30,000 feet, and we're going to continue to do that, but this is a replacement study until the point comes that we can gather again to meet together in person. The nature of that Bible study with the Q&A and the exchange and so on, it just is better to do in person, and I just felt like I needed to put that on pause until we could come back together again. But in the meantime, I'm going to do these short little studies that I'm calling Connecting the Dots. So far we've looked in our 30,000 foot study from Genesis through the book of Leviticus, and our next study was the book of Numbers. And again, we're not going to do that one until we've gathered together in person. But what I do want to do is take a story from that book that is a strange story, and I want to look at it because it connects to the New Testament in two striking ways, and I want to draw your attention to it. So it's in Numbers chapter 21 in verses 5 through 9, and this is what it says. The people spoke against God and Moses, "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water, and we loathe this miserable food." They were talking about the manna. "The Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, so that many people of Israel died. So the people came to Moses and said, 'We have sinned because we have spoken against the Lord, and you intercede with the Lord that he may remove the serpents from us.' And Moses interceded for the people. Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Make a fiery serpent and set it on a standard, and it shall come about that everyone who is bitten, when he looks at it, he will live.' And Moses made a bronze serpent and set it on the standard, and it came about that if a serpent bit any man, when he looked at the bronze serpent, he died." All right, if you now take that story, again, these people have sinned, they're complaining, which they seem to do all the time. And if you take that story and God sent serpents into the camp. They started getting bit by all these snakes. They go to Moses. Moses takes a statue out of bronze and has it cast, a bronze serpent, literally puts it on a pole, sticks it up on a hill somewhere. And so instead of getting rid of the snakes, he sticks the serpent up there, and then the people still are getting bit. But when they do get bit, they can look over at the serpent and they're healed. Strange story. But fast forward now 1,500 years to the time of Jesus. Jesus is meeting with a man named Nicodemus, who was one of the leaders of the Jews. He was a Pharisee. But he saw something different about Jesus, the authority with which he spoke, the signs that he was able to do. There were things going on that made Nicodemus curious, and we find out later that Nicodemus actually becomes a follower of Christ. But Jesus is talking to him about being born again. In fact, the most famous verse in the Bible comes out of that encounter, John 3:16, where Jesus said, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him shall not perish but have everlasting life." But there's another verse in a statement that Jesus made in that passage that goes all the way back to the story of the snake on the pole. In John chapter 3, verses 14 and 15, the two verses just before the famous verse, it says this: "As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up, so that whoever believes in him will have eternal life." So Jesus is saying to Nicodemus that the snake on the pole is a prophetic picture of him. The pole is a picture of the cross. The fact that it was made out of bronze is a symbol of judgment, because the altars, as we shared in Exodus and Leviticus, were made out of bronze because they could withstand heat. And so you have Jesus being judged on the cross. And if the people look to him, they'll be saved, just like the Israelites. The snakes are still coming. They're still being bitten by the snake. We're still being bitten by the snake of sin. And if the people looked at that bronze pole, they would be healed. If we look to Jesus, who is on the cross, then we will be saved, or we will be healed from sin in our lives. So that's the picture that's being drawn. But the question would be, why are we comparing Jesus to a snake? That's kind of odd. I mean, the serpent has always been a symbol of evil. But Jesus was pure and he was without sin. So why compare Jesus to a snake? Well, it's because Jesus was judged as if he were sin. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 21, we read, He made him, or God made him, who knew no sin, to be sin on our behalf, so that we might become the righteousness of God in him. So God literally treated Jesus as if he were sin, and he took all the sin of the world upon him. And then when Jesus was judged and destroyed on the cross, sin was destroyed. All right. So that's why the snake is being used as a symbol of Jesus. But this snake had an interesting history. Many generations. Now go back to the time of Moses again. Moses makes a snake, sticks it on a pole. People get bit by the serpent. They look at the snake, they're healed. Well, in time, that judgment went away, and probably the snake got tucked away somewhere. But they kept it. They carried it around with them. Well, generations later, in the days of Hezekiah, this is now after the days of King David, so this is hundreds and hundreds of years later, the people took that serpent on the pole and they literally turned it into an idol and they began to worship it. Israel devolved into idolatry and they started worshiping all kinds of false gods. And so Hezekiah came to the throne, and he was a king that brought revival to the people of Israel. And he found this snake, realizing that the people had worshipped it, and he destroyed it. And so in 2 Kings 18:4, it says, He removed the high places and broke down the sacred pillars and cut down the Asherah. Those are all different, Asherahs, different kinds of gods. And then it says, And he also broke in pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made, for until those days the sons of Israel burned incense to it, and it was called a Nehushtan. Now that word Nehushtan means a piece of brass. So Hezekiah was saying this is not a god, it's just a piece of brass, and he destroyed the thing. Well, in pagan cultures, a whole religion grew up around this snake because the snake was identified with the Roman god Asclepius, and the Romans considered Asclepius to be the god of healing, and his symbol was a snake on a pole. And we see this today, even in our own medical community, as you can see from this symbol, that the symbol of the medical field is a snake on a pole. Now here you have two snakes on a pole, which is actually the god of commerce, which is maybe more telling. But the symbol of Asclepius was a snake on a pole. Now the dots were connected for me when I was visiting Israel. We went to Israel and we were in Jerusalem, and we came to a place that was called the Pool of Bethesda, which was an archaeological site where there had been a pool in Israel. You can see a picture of it here. And it was a rather large pool. And in the story in the New Testament, what was happening is that people gathered around this pool in order to be healed. They believed that the waters had healing properties, that an angel of the Lord or an angel would stir the waters, and the first one to get into the water would get healed. That was the idea. So they were gathered around this pool. And so that location became associated with healing because it was called the Pool of Bethesda. Well, today we have hospitals that go by the name Bethesda because it's considered the symbol of healing. Now the pool was large. It was over 50 feet deep, and you can see from the picture of the ruins that it was quite deep. It was long. It had 5 different shallow waiting areas outside the deep area, and so people were lying on porches and in the shallows and along the edge, and they were all in physical misery waiting for the waters to be stirred so they could be the first one in and supposedly get healed by the waters. Well, apparently this place was famous for that because the multitudes were huge, and because, you know, if an angel touches the water and you can get in it first and you can get healed, you're going to be there if there's a guarantee that that happens. But was it really an angel that was stirring the waters, or was it just superstition? I personally believe that it was superstition. I don't think an angel was stirring the waters for a couple of reasons. Archaeologists have discovered a subterranean stream just beneath the pool. And so that stream would create bubbles, and it would cause the water to bubble up every once in a while, and they thought that was an angel. And also the angel that the people were looking for was not the angel of Jehovah. It wasn't the angel of the Lord. The way it reads in the New Testament, it sounds like it is. They were waiting for the angel of the Lord to stir the waters, but that actually is a piece of the story that was inserted in later manuscripts. It's not in the original manuscripts. They were waiting for the waters to be stirred. Well, when I was in Jerusalem at that pool, the tour guide there told us that the Romans had built many structures in the city of Jerusalem. You know, there's a horse racing track, and all kinds of Roman buildings were put in the ancient city. And then he told us something about this site that really connected the dots for me. He said, on this site at this pool, the Romans had built a shrine to the god Asclepius, because the Romans believed in all of these different gods. That's the God of healing. That's the God whose symbol is the snake on a pole. That's the God that the people began to worship with the snake that Moses had built and that Hezekiah destroyed. And so the angel that the people believed was stirring the waters was the angel of Asclepius, not the angel of the Lord. And so for a Jew to be around this pool waiting for some pagan god to stir the waters, well, that's taboo for the Jews. But, I mean, they had worshipped the snake on a pole before. And when you're sick, you're desperate enough that you'll seek any source you can to find healing. And so that's what they were doing. Well, Jesus understood the significance of that site. I mean, for centuries, the god, small g, the god Asclepius, had been looked to for healing and life. And so Jesus came to that place, to the most hopeless of all. In fact, the guy that he approached, and he eventually healed him. If you remember, Jesus asked the man, what does he want? And he says he wants to be healed. And Jesus told him, he said, arise, take up your pallet and go home. The man didn't have to go to the water. Jesus healed him right then and there. But this guy had been sick for 38 years. So he'd been lying there at the pool for 38 years. So Jesus found the most desperate guy and healed that guy. And by his act of power, Jesus demonstrated that he was the God of healing. Asclepius was not the God of healing. It was Jesus who was the God of healing. And so when the serpent was originally made by Moses, it pointed to Christ. And Christ would fulfill that ancient prophecy by dying on the cross. But here he challenged the myth that grew up around the prophecy. And so Jesus brings spiritual healing to our lives. The snake represents that, but he also brings physical healing to our lives. In Isaiah 53 verse 5 we read, but he was pierced through for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The chastening for our well-being fell upon him, and by his scourging we are healed. Peter says, by his stripes we are healed. Spiritual healing is ours now, and we will fully step into that when we're glorified, but physical healing was also purchased for us as well. Jesus is demonstrating this by healing this man at the pool of Bethesda. Here's the thing, though. Jesus purchased your physical healing, but he chooses how much of it he will release on this side of eternity. I mean, someday when we step into eternity, all the physical healing will be released and we will be immortal. But Jesus releases some of that now. He's already purchased it, but he chooses how much of it to release to us now. And so Jesus, like that snake on a pole, was lifted up on a cross to purchase our spiritual healing, to heal us from the disease of sin, and to purchase our physical healing, to give us the promise of eternal life forever and ever. That's something for which to give God praise. Well, thank you for joining me. And I look forward to seeing you next week as we connect the dots.